All right, welcome everyone. Thank you to our in-person audience for joining us live tonight. And thank you to our virtual audience for tuning in tonight for A Tale of Two Forests, Histories of Ecology and Management in Mexico and Arizona. Today, Dr. Chris Boyer will be talking about forest management here in Arizona and in Mexico through the lens of environmental history. And as you all may know already, the Climate Conversation Series is hosted by Arizona Humanities. We are the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Arizona Humanities supports humanities-based public programs with cultural, educational, and nonprofit organizations across Arizona. And this program is made possible by funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And for those of you viewing at home, what we're going to do is we'll have Dr. Boyer present his talk, and then we're going to transition into Q&A. So if you have any questions for Dr. Boyer, you can drop them in the chat, which should be to the right of this screen. You will need a Google account to use the chat. So if you don't have a Google account, you can also add your questions to the form, which is linked at the bottom below this screen, and I'll also include it in the chat in just a second. But if you have any questions during the talk, please put them in the chat or in that question form. And for our in-person audience, we'll be passing around a mic after the presentation. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight. Chris Boyer is Dean of Arts and Letters and Professor of History at Northern Arizona University. Dr. Boyer is a specialist on the social and environmental history of modern Mexico and Latin America. His most recent book, Political Landscapes, investigates social history of forest management in Mexico between 1880 and 2000. He has published a volume of environmental histories of modern Mexico titled A Land Between Waters that represents the first binational reflection on Mexican environmental history. He co-edits a University of Arizona Press book series on Latin American environmental history, and he was also a visiting scholar at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, excuse my pronunciation, in 2017, where he taught and continued work on his current research project that traces how the Green Revolution technologies pioneered in Mexico are linked with the industrialization of foodways in Mexico and beyond. And I also want to mention that Dr. Boyer is also an Arizona Humanities board member, so we are very excited to have him today. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Boyer.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank you for coming out. And for those of you who are online, I want to thank you as well for taking the time to listen to this presentation that I have today. Before I start, I should make a little bit of a confession. As you have heard, I am a historian of Mexican environmental history, and that's a topic I know something about. I teach about and have read about U.S. and U.S. Southwest and Arizona environmental history, but I haven't actually done real scholarship on that myself, aside from what I will show you this evening. And so there's an asymmetry in my knowledge, but I think that it will be enough to give you a sense of what the differences between these two countries are and why things environmentally are different in both countries, despite the fact that ecologically they're quite similar. But if you ask me detailed questions about about Arizona's environmental history, at the end of this, I might or might not know the answer. So with that, let me set up what the basic problem is. Bip. Okay, maybe bip. Ha ha. There we go. Now we're cooking. Okay. So the challenge that you can see here is that ponderosa pine forests, which of course are not the only types of forests that are subject to forest fires, but ponderosa pine, which is the ecology that I live in now in Flagstaff, exists well down through the Sierra Madre Oriental in Mexico, some other places along the coast. I think that's actually probably the state of Veracruz, and then up through the United States and into southern Canada. So these ecologies aren't entirely the same. It goes without saying that there are some places where particularly there's greater amount of water in parts of Canada, certainly in parts of California and Oregon. But the basic biota that live within these forests aren't all that different. And in particular, if you kind of look at the forests that are coming up through northern Mexico, that's mainly the states of Durango and Chihuahua, where the Mexican beige part is there, and then up into Arizona and New Mexico, which is the next highest beige large chunk. You can see that they're not separated by all that much. They're both in highlands, relatively speaking. Yes, it is true that the New Mexico, Arizona lands are a bit higher, but not tremendously higher. Chihuahua, actually, and Durango are both very mountainous parts of the country, and so they're a couple thousand feet lower. But the ecology, if you were to walk around these two places, is not dramatically different. I think fundamentally what's important is that what foresters would call the understory, the other plants that grow underneath the ponderosas, are pretty similar in both places because the water regime is largely similar, and the amount of daylight they get is largely similar, and the elevation is largely similar. And yet, right, in Mexico you don't hear, and it's not just because we're not hearing this on the news. In Mexico, it is less common. It's not unknown, but it is less common to have the huge sorts of forest fires that are common in the U.S. Southwest. And the reason for that, I'm trying to illustrate here, is not because the ecology is different. And of course, forests don't care about national borders. So it's not because Mexican forests are nicer or something like that. It is because the way that these forests have been managed over the last 120, 130 years have been different in each case. And sort of the point of what I want to do today is not to say, oh gosh, Mexico has been so much more clever in managing its forests than has the United States, because that's not quite the story either. But the management has been different, and therefore the outcome has been different, both in terms of the forest, and I'll briefly talk about some of the fauna at the very end as well. So, one of the big differences, it's not the best image, but what you can glean from this image here is that really from the western United States, east of Kansas and Nebraska and the Dakotas, is largely federal lands. There's different colors there because those federal lands include, as probably many of you know, lands that are owned by the Bureau of Land Management, and national forests, and some national parks and monuments. But what's really tremendous, I mean, if you look at Arizona, or if you look at Nevada, the majority of the land is federal land, which means that it is managed by these federal entities, which do so in slightly different ways that I'm going to ignore for the purposes of what we're talking about tonight. On the East Coast, with the exception of Appalachia, there are basically very few federally owned forests. So the rest of these forests in the United States are owned by private landowners. Now, these were forested lands at one point, many of them. Some of them were prairie. But it is noteworthy that if you think about where you've heard about there being big fires in the United States these days, it is in California and Arizona and New Mexico and Wyoming and so forth. That is to say, the lands that have been managed by the federal government. So what the federal government does basically is that it is charged with until quite recently, with maximally using this land in the public good. And so to simplify a bit, there's two components of what that has meant up until the last 25 years or so. Basically, let's make sure we put this into production. So in my hometown of Flagstaff, in 1890, you already had private forestry companies working on public lands because they got leases and they had permission to do the logging. So that production, the idea, this productivist mentality of what we need to do is to take this land and make money, make it be valuable, make it, build cities like Houston and Phoenix using timber, and also railroads. The other big thing that mining and railroads require a lot of wood. So that was one side of what the federal land management was about. The other side was protecting this and using it and protecting this land over time, over time, so that there would be multiple generations, so that it wouldn't all get cut down at once. And what that has meant, essentially, is that in the United States, we've had some places where there are clear cuts. I mean, do note the background here, right? This is a part of, Flagstaff is now fully forested. It is much less forested 130 years ago. But they did leave a little bit of trees around, as you can see from the photograph. But basically, you got a combination of clear cuts and fire suppression. Fire suppression because the real theory was that you need to make sure that no fires burn, so that those trees are going to be there to be used commercially at some point in the future. Does that make sense? So it's all of this, it's sort of this maximum productivity is the theory behind what the United States was doing. And part of that was, of course, to use it, but the other part of it was to really suppress fire at all costs. If we compare that with Mexico, you don't need to worry too much about what you're looking at here, except let me just, well, no. If you'll recall the map that I showed previously of where there are forests, actually I will go back real quick. One more, and boom. All right. So that lower beige splotch, if you look forward here, that lower beige splotch is basically where that central Mexico blue chunk of blueness is. Now, what does that blueness mean? So I went to 1894 Mexico. If we go to for the United States, if we go to 1910 in Mexico, that's when the Mexican Revolution broke out. And I'll just tell you, never ask a historian, isn't things, please talk about more about this, because then we'll be here all night, which would be great. But you don't, you'll have to trust me to say that the Mexican Revolution was caused by essentially two things. One was a political crisis, a political succession crisis, wherein the former president, who had been president for a long time, had a hard time coming up with a succession plan, and that led to a scramble for power. That's part of it. The other part of it was inequality that had been generated because of the Mexican model of development, which was basically to rely a lot on the United States to do mining, forestry, and other extractive industries, petroleum. And so the people who were making the money from the sorts of environmental, the sorts of economic activities were the people who were attached with the international economy, not the people who were doing the work or whose land it was going on. So this inequality part meant that the Mexican Revolution always had a very strong social justice component. Pancho Villa and famously Emiliano Zapata, the two guys with the big hats. These people were really fighting, particularly Zapata, on behalf of social justice. And what that meant essentially was putting wealth back in the hands of the people. Since most of the wealth in the country at that time was land, it meant putting land back into the hands of the people. So that's a long way of saying what you're looking at here is land. The blue is land that is owned by the communities within them. And particularly, in many places, forests that were controlled by foreign interests that end up being given back to the communities that live within those forests as part of a big land reform that started in 1917 and ran forward really until 1989. So this was a successful land reform. It actually put the land back in the hands of the people who lived in it. And to the point that today, 2/3 of all of the land in Mexico is owned by these communities. Now, that creates a different sort of land management problem. If the United States land management problem was how do we get companies and how do we do forest suppression, the land management problem in Mexico was how do we make sure that rural people log their lands sustainably so that they don't just cut them all down, make money, and then run cattle there and convert that, and that did happen some. But there's also many instances of communities that took the long view, and many of these actually are indigenous communities, that took the long view of their lands and would manage their lands over time so that there'd be something for their children and grandchildren to also log. Most communities don't make the majority of their money on timber, but they make enough that it is an important supplement to the other things that they're doing. But they're continuing to use the land. They never stopped using the land. And there's this constant tension of how much of the wood should we cut down? How much money should we make this year? And so that actually leads to all kinds of schemes that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A if you want. One of the earliest, though, and this is, I think I mention this because it's illustrative, for a period of about 10 years, beginning in the 1930s, going into the 1940s, the idea was to create cooperatives. The cooperatives would be the people who did the logging. They would then sell the logs to the middlemen who would put it onto the market. And that would give the communities a source of income, but it would also give the federal government a way of managing how the communities are using the woods. The foresters could come and talk to the leaders of these cooperatives. And this particular cooperative is the one of Cusarde. These are Raramuri, sometimes known as Tarahumara people, and these are the guys who are doing the logging. So if in the United States it was primarily let's make sure that we have big logging companies beginning already in the 1890s and even earlier in some places. In Mexico the idea was let's go small, at least for a while, they did this. Let's go small and try to manage these lands locally. It's a little bit harder to see the background here, but you can kind of make out that the background of this picture is a denser forest, because with more labor and communities that want to protect their land multiple generations, yes, they cut down the trees, but they would cut down one and leave one, cut down one and leave one. And this, as it turns out, is better for the forest. And I'll tip my hand right now. It's also what we would now call selective logging, which is essentially what we now recognize as the best way of maintaining forest health in ponderosa forests and indeed in coniferous forests everywhere. So what does this all mean? In the United States, because it's a wealthier country, and also because of the Depression that led the federal government to begin hiring labor to work in the forests, beginning in the 1930s, you had big professional fire brigades working for the Park Service or working for the National Forest. So whenever there was a fire, the United States was actually in a position of attempting, anyway, to suppress it. And this actually was official policy from the 1930s until around 15 years ago. So the idea was, we don't want forest fires. I'm of the generation where I remember Smokey Bear, right? You just have to think about Smokey Bear, like put it out, stamp it out, da-da-da. Now we know, those of you who live in Arizona know that we have planned burns and all that stuff. That's all new. That is a relatively recent way of treatment, a treatment for the forest that was completely out of step with the way that the United States managed its forests for about 100, not quite 100, but for multiple, 3 generations, let's put it that way. Mexico also did have fire suppression. I put this up there because I just love this poster that I found. And it's about how los incendios y las cabras queman y destruyen en forma singular. It's forest fires. You can actually look in the background. There's smoke rising from a forest fire, and goats, which are fairly common in northern Mexico as family animals, domestic animals. They both destroy the forest in the same way. So there were attempts at forest fire suppression and goat suppression in Mexico. But the thing is because there really wasn't a National Forest Service in the same sense as there was in the United States for most of the 20th century, the people who were charged with doing the forest fire suppression were the communities themselves. And the communities would often actually do their own fire treatment. They're like, well, actually, those trees up there are damaged or they are diseased, so we're not actually going to fight that fire up at that part. Yeah, these trees over here, we've been protecting them for the last 50 years. We'll fight that. And no, we won't go over to our neighbors. So if our neighbors aren't going to fight the fire over there, well, that's their business. We'll just fight it in our community. This matters because it means you get a patchwork of small fires in Mexico beginning in the night, again, around the same time, rather than a national policy of fire suppression. So if you look at what we have today, this is a photograph of, again, my home in the Coconino National Forest. This is an unnatural forest. That's not how ponderosa pine forests should look. This is probably 50 to 60, maybe more % denser than it should be. And indeed, if you look at the trees, you can actually see they're all more or less the same age. We know this because they're all about the same amount, the same size. So what happened here? Well, what happened here was that either there was a big forest fire that went through and destroyed a large stand of trees, and these trees grew up thereafter, or more likely, this area was logged and just clear cut, and these trees then grew up thereafter. So what you end up with in the United States, and it is throughout the West, are these stands of similar aged trees that are overly dense. They're similar aged probably because of logging, perhaps because of fire. They are overly dense because we've been suppressing fire forever. So if this were a natural forest, it would look more like what you might see if you go to a forest that has now been treated in Arizona. That would, and by that I mean they've cut down around half the trees. And if you know a forest well, say up around Flagstaff or northern Arizona, and you went there 2 years ago, and you walked back there and you expected it to look like this, and you walk in there and it's much, much less dense. It is a forest that is much more open. There are, you can see stumps around because the way they treat this is to cut it down. Then you would say, wow, something went terribly wrong there, when in fact, something went terribly right. That's what the Forest Service is doing now, because they've come to realize that complete fire suppression is a mistake because it leads to, get ready for it, right? It leads to these huge fires that you can't put out because there's so much fuel in the forests. So in the West, you're getting these large fires because of the fuel, because of the conformation of the forest. And it's the job of the Forest Service now, and it's an immense job, to try to thin all of the forests in the U.S. West to make them more natural. And that's why you get these prescribed burns. They're supposed to be small. Sometimes they do, get out of control, as we all know, and there have been instances in which they have lost control of these prescribed fires, and they end up to be, disastrous. But that wouldn't happen quite the same way if we weren't in the pickle that we find ourselves in the U.S. Southwest. And I mean, you can just see this is that same fire. Those of you who know anything about Flagstaff know that the museum fire was a real mess, and it led to flooding afterwards. One of the reasons it leads to flooding is because the fires are also unnatural fires. They're too hot. The fires should not kill. A forest fire should not kill every single tree that it touches. It can kill some, but the larger ones actually should be able to survive if there weren't so much fuel for the fire to use. And these really super hot, super large fires are, again, they're unnatural fires. And in the case of Flagstaff, this has led to the glassification of, you can actually see in the lower left, that dirt has been changed to glass. That's a problem because then when we get monsoon, the water comes rushing down, we get flooding, and so it has all of these other ecological implications that are bad. In Mexico, you have to remember these ejidos, they're communities. There's an old saw in forestry. I'm a historian, so I can say old saws. It's okay. And that old saw is you can make anything with wood except for money. Logging just doesn't produce that much money. And so with a couple of exceptions, and by a couple I mean out of the 1,000 or so community-owned forests in Mexico, there's probably around 25 that survive primarily by logging or logging and resin production. So what you see here is a landscape that is used multiple different ways. It is a forest, but you can see that it's actually multiple aged. On the right-hand side, we have some older trees. On the left-hand side, we have some medium-aged trees. In the foreground, we see young trees. Those have been planted, and actually have been planted too densely by the community. That is not what we're after, actually. But the point being that they had logged that area, and then they went back and they seeded. And so that's called rotation. So that in this area, they can cut, one year they can cut these older trees, the next year they can cut the next older, or 5 years down the pike, they can cut the next oldest trees, and then eventually they'll be able to cut the ones in the foreground if they're not too dense and kill each other. But you can also see there's lots of kind of open land, and the lower lands are used for agriculture because this is multiple use. And so these forests are actually healthier as a result of it. They're not as extensive, they're more patchwork. They are, and that's all because in some ways, and this is the other big takeaway I would ask, is that in Mexico, because of the history, there was a possibility for forests and communities to socially co-evolve. Not biologically necessarily, but there's been a co-evolution as people have learned, or some people have learned how to use their lands. Native peoples have often actually been freed up to be able to use their lands the way they already knew how to do it. So it depends on the precise circumstance. But this variety of ages, variety of uses of the land not every forest needs to look like an unbroken green carpet for it to be healthy. And so because of the history, Mexican forests did end up being more healthy. And as a result, the fires you get there are typically smaller. They sometimes need to be fought, but you don't end up with these huge gargantuan, what happened in Canada last summer, what's happened in Arizona 2 summers before that, what happened in California 3 summers before that. You don't typically end up with these same immense fires, and that's because of this process of coevolution. I'll kind of wrap up by saying just one quick example. In case you're thinking that I'm saying, well, gosh, Mexico got everything right and the United States got everything wrong, which it kind of did in terms of forest treatment, I actually would say that's actually a fair assessment. Although I don't think it's not because of ill will, it's because of just radically different histories. Mexico used to have the Mexican gray wolf is indeed from Mexico, as you might imagine, including, I guess, what you might call old Mexico, or the former Mexico that is now the U.S. Southwest. But it no longer exists there. Whereas in Arizona and New Mexico, that blue area up there, that teal area, is the wolf recovery area, project, but the greater, darker yellow is the proposed habitat for Mexican gray wolves if they can get this very nearly endangered species to continue as it is to thrive in the United States. The reason why the United States has been successful with that and Mexico has not is because of the same thing as I just talked about. There are fewer people who are living in rural United States than there are who are living in rural Mexico. In Mexico, rural communities often still see wolves as a threat. Sometimes they are a threat. As I showed you the picture of their goats. Mexicans, some Mexican communities continue to be dependent upon their goats and other domestic animals for their wealth, and the fear of wolves is such that people kill them typically. In the United States, there's some of that, but it's also less densely populated in this area, and we have the resources in this country to consider doing something like this reintroduction process, and we have the laws that make it possible for us to punish people effectively if they kill wolves, usually, and simply the resources within our land management to allow this to at least give us a shot at seeing if this will work. So, like everything, right? It's complicated. So the wolves are a counterpoint in which the United States has been more successful with its land management than has Mexico because of the same reasons, because of the same history that has allowed us to have this robust rural presence of the federal government in a way that same thing does not exist in Mexico. So, if you want to learn more, there's a couple of books you can look at. One is the old standby Cadillac Desert. It is now truly out of date, but it's a great read. It talks about water in the U.S. Southwest. The cover of that book talks about is a picture of, I believe, Texas on one side and Chihuahua on the other. The green is Texas, and that's the International Canal separating the two of them. And so it talks about the history of water policies in the United States, which has a lot to do. The next book that I would really recommend strongly, and may even be that he is out there in the audience, I don't know. If so, hi, Steve. Steve Pine is the world's foremost fire historian, who actually has also himself just written a book about fire in Mexico. So this book that I have here is sort of a global history of fire and reflection on fire, the Pyrocene. But he also has several books about fire in the U.S. Southwest, fire in Mexico, and this one I chose it because it's sort of the broadest of them. He teaches here at Arizona State, so he is a towering figure in my field. Two other quick ones. One is Wilderness in the American Mind. This is an American classic. This is one of the places where American environmental history began. And I like it because one of the things that I didn't talk that much about today, because I don't want to bore you to death. I just want to bore you close to death. I didn't talk very much about sort of social and cultural differences. The argument of this book, Wilderness and the American Mind, argues that in the early American Republic, one of the things that shaped America's identity was people soon after independence saying, yeah, you Europeans think you're so great, we have wilderness. Wilderness is a word that does not exist in most other languages. And it's the wildness of American landscape that makes us a young, vibrant country. And how that idea really has found its way into American culture, I think it's a really compelling book. And then this right-hand book, this fabulous book here by me, is basically the general history of forests in Mexico, looking at this relationship between social history, revolutions and things like that, and the forests themselves. And so these are all available on Amazon, and I make $1 a book, so by all means, go nuts. So with that, I'll thank you so much for your time and thoughts, and I would love to hear yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boyer. We have some questions in the chat for you, but I'd also like to open it up to our in-person audience and invite more folks in the virtual audience to submit their questions. I'm going to start with a question in the chat first.
Sure.
This is from Steve. He asks, how does the Mexico forest management regime comport with the research being done or having been done over the last few decades at the NAU School of Forestry, notably under Emeritus Professor Wally Covington?
So Wally Covington, for those of you who do not know, is a towering figure in American forestry studies. He was the first, one of the first to recognize the issue that I saw right here. So Wally Covington did begin to notice, well, how come we have big fires in one place and we don't have big fires in another place? He was at the leading edge of a change within the discipline of forestry to say, gosh, if we want to understand what a forest looks like and why it's ecologically different in one place or another, we need to look at the past. So forestry as a discipline, as a science, has taken a historical turn, some foresters would say, to say, hey, let's look at this. The way that he and his first generation of students did this was very clever. It was by looking at the land itself. They began doing things like counting stumps, looking at when forests were done. What historians like me do is we do less work in the woods, and actually doing work in the woods in northern Mexico right now is probably not the wisest idea because there are personal safety issues there. But to look at, I look at documents, and there's various different types of documents that can allow me to tell a different story than he tells. It's not a better or worse, it's more readable for as good as they are. And then there's been a new generation of people who have been using remote sensing of various sorts to try to tell this same story, to try to get to look at all forests throughout time. So he was one of the leaders of that, and he was also one of the first to take seriously the fact that these ecologies on in northern Mexico and the southern U.S. are so similar. Let's use this as a natural experiment, I believe is probably the way he would have looked at that.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the in-person audience yet?
Hi. So it kind of sounds from your presentation as if we've learned our lesson in America. I don't know if that's the correct characterization.
I think that's actually not too
how
far.
long will it take us to get out of this pickle that we got ourselves into?
Boy, I don't know that I can answer that question very intelligently. I will say it's going to be a while. So if you look at where forests are getting treated primarily these days, it is, as you might imagine, closer to population centers. So this is a defensive posture to protect cities and towns from the worst of the, by thinning the forests, and therefore making it less likely that forest fires will rush through and do what we saw happen in the tragic case of California 3 years ago. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, it's going to be decades. How many, I can't tell you. One of the things that's really interesting is that, in fact, if you cut down a tree, the second you've cut it down, there's no reason for you to not take that tree and use it to produce electricity. People are like, why would we burn trees to produce energy? Because they're going to make, it's like burning trees. It seems environmentally unfriendly. But if you already cut it down, then the carbon that tree has is going to get released into the atmosphere. So you may as well burn it. And that is actually becoming common in northern Europe. The United States has really yet to get on board, but in fact, a carbon neutral way, if you're going to cut the tree down anyway, or do staged or do planned burns anyway, if you cut them down and start making power plants out of cellulose. If we go that way, that would actually create a market incentive that might mean that it's not just the Forest Department, the U.S. Forest Service that is doing the cutting. That would actually, you could create incentives for energy companies to begin doing the same thing, and that might speed things up if they do it the right way. And then, of course, that's the question.
Thank you. We're going to pivot to the virtual audience for another question, and then we'll come back to the in-person audience. We have a question from Mary. Do you know if the Tohono O'odham of southern Arizona and northern Mexico were allowed to co-evolve with their indigenous homelands? And what sustainable environmental practices did they use?
Wow, that is a huge question. I should say that in the book that I mentioned, I looked at two indigenous groups in particular. One that I mentioned were the Raramuri, sometimes known as the Tarahumara. The other were the Purepecha people of central western Mexico, sometimes known as Tarascans. So I could actually speak a little bit intelligently about them. What I can say about the Tohono O'odham people is that they did live, they knew the depth of knowledge they had about the environment in which they lived is tremendous. And to my mind, what comes, and this is just based on my reading, not on my research, is their knowledge of hydrology and how to channel arroyos, seasonal rivers, for purposes that they need, using brush oftentimes, and using the woods that they had available to them, clearly evinces a deep knowledge of the rains, of the qualities of the biota that they were surrounded by. And so, indeed, there's no question that that there was a much longer period of what I've called coevolution that led to a deep and abiding, because that knowledge still exists, knowledge of their surroundings. Going beyond that into the specifics is probably more than I could reasonably do and not run out of my own knowledge.
Great. Thank you so much. And I think we had another question
Yeah,
here in the in-person audience.
Oh, was there much pushback going from suppressing fires to letting fires burn?
Oh.
The forest industry?
So the question was there pushback? There was and is pushback. The pushback comes in various forms. Initially, the Forest Service itself, I mean, you had generations of foresters who had grown up with Smokey the Bear and fire suppression and this, the way that the West, I'm from Colorado, I've lived in the East Coast, I've lived in the Midwest, I've lived in Mexico. And there is a particularly Western understanding of efficiency. You can't have water just running into the ocean. That's inefficient. We're not using that water. We should capture it and use it in dams. You can't have fires just burn. That's inefficient. We should be using that to build cities and railroads and so forth. And so this efficiency, maximal utilization mentality is deeply ingrained in forestry going way back, and in industry as well. So when it became clear that there was a problem, foresters took a while to come around. Once they did, and I would say most of them have, although I think that there's still debates within the scientific community about what's best. Once they did, then there became a problem of the private sector. We sort of said, well, wait a minute, can't we, there should be a way that we could be more fully involved, and in some places they are, but it's been hard to do because, again, it's hard to thin forests for commercial purposes in a way that is actually economically viable. So that's a real challenge that we have. And then there's public perception. Why in the world are you letting our forests burn? And particularly on, whenever there's a controlled burn that gets out of control, and sometimes, again, with tragic consequences, the public goes nuts because we also grew up with Smokey the Bear. We also grew up with what we shouldn't just let the forest burn. We also grew up with, I love my forest. I don't want to have my forest look like that photo that I showed of the museum fire. I don't. I mean, that's right by my house. I don't want it to look like that. So it's understandable that there has been pushback in various different directions. I think that there's a consensus within the scientific community and the forestry community that thinning the forests is absolutely necessary. So that part, I think, is there's mostly consensus. Everywhere else, your guess is as good as mine.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask a question from the virtual audience. We have one from Andrea. Does the U.S. Forest Service work with the entities in Mexico to learn best practices, such as helping with fire suppression when needed? Are their prescribed burn projects similar to ours? Wow,
that's a great question. That is a great question. I could answer that question well for the 1950s and 60s, when there was indeed a lot of collaboration between the two forest services. Again, just keeping in mind that in Mexico, it's just much more decentralized because the people who own the land is much more decentralized. So in Mexico, there's been a never-ending complaint amongst federal forestry officials that we have to deal with these darn peasants, rural people, campesinos, who we tell them what to do and they don't do it. And so there's always been this kind of expert versus local, and we have that in the U.S. as well. But in Mexico, the locals own the land, and they say, we own the land, and then the other people say, well, the law is anyway. So the context is different. of late, so really since the 1950s, there have been a number of things. Forestry schools in the United States train the vast majority of foresters worldwide. With the exception of Russia, which has huge forests of its own, most other countries that have large forests send their students to U.S. forestry schools, and we are, American forestry schools are the best, basically, I think. There's great schools in Europe, there's great schools in Asia, but the reason they come here is because there's this tradition and also an intellectual openness. So in terms of the formation of the foresters, yes. In terms of the actual coordination, yes and no. It's not, the answer is it's not systematic, as far as I know. So it is not hard to find a Mexican forester who's actually done a rotation in the United States, or vice versa. It's not hard to find a Mexican graduate student in forestry who trained at NAU or Colorado State or wherever, and then came back down and keeps that contact going. That's not hard. But as far as I know, and I could be wrong, but as far as I know, there's no robust binational treatment, and that's probably in part because the forests themselves are somewhat different.
Thank you so much. Do we have any more questions from our in-person audience?
I'm kind of formulating a question. Okay. One of the things, because I've lived in a few different parts of the country and the world as well, that you didn't address is the fact that ponderosa pine also grows in an area with very low rainfall, yeah, which affects ecological processes. And it seems that when you're working up your prescription for how much to remove, when and where, it's much more important. Our environment in the Intermountain West and into northern Mexico is so much more fragile that it's important to leave a lot of dead and young material down. And I'm kind of curious as to how the federal agencies are addressing that, and more importantly, how you're educating the public.
Ha! Wow, another terrific question. And where I thought you might be going with that is, since the rain regime is so very important for these forests, how do we know what's going to happen with climate change?
Well, that too.
Just to further complicate the whole picture, the great thing about being a historian is that I can't look forward at all. Never ask a historian for their opinion on what might happen, because we always get it wrong. Yes, what you say is exactly right. I did. It does matter what type of forests we're talking about, and for many different reasons that you have alluded to. One of them is how fast do these trees grow? Ponderosas grow slowly, relatively speaking, compared to other conifers, in part because of their biology, but in part because they are drought adapted. Let me just signal one thing that's a challenge with that. If you're the U.S. government and you want to do forestry rotation, you can actually reasonably say, we're going to do a 50-year rotation. You find the map, you draw a square, you say, we're going to divide that square into 50 different small squares. We're going to cut this part in this year. Next year we're going to cut until we get all the way through 50. Then we'll start at the beginning. Now, the United States government doesn't actually do that much, but that is one quote-unquote sustainable way of doing, one way to do what we might call sustainable forestry. Maybe. I mean, maybe. That won't work in Mexico. Because you can't go to a community that has a couple of thousand acres and say, well, we're going to put you on a 50-year rotation, which means you can cut down like 3 trees this year, and you can cut down 3 trees next year, and no, it won't work there. There's not enough income. So what you have to do there is say you can cut down some trees this year, then you're going to have to wait a decade, and you can cut down trees next year. Well, maybe. Some places do that. Some places have that ethos within the community that is, it's worth it, and we're going to look that many generations down the pike. But not everywhere. And if people are saying, really what we should do is just cut down these trees and run cattle, and we can make money, and that's the way to do it, and yes, we know that it'll harm the land, and it's ecologically damaging, but it's a way of survival, they may do that. And one other thing that actually impacts this is the following. There are communities that have worked very hard to have sustainable forestry practices. We're not going to touch that stand of trees over there because that's for our grandchildren. Somebody says, you know what, my kid needs medicine. I'm going to go and work in the United States. I'm going to make money so that I can give them medicine. So I need to get money so that I can pay for an undocumented crossing of the border. That costs these days around $6,000. So they look at that stand of trees, and they go out in the middle of the night with a pickup truck, and they cut down as many of them as they can without people noticing. And they sell that illegally, of course at a steep discount. And they at least use that as the beginning of the capital that they need in order to make a new life for themselves. So where you get people who are displaced by violence or by economic need or ecological need, it can also lead to greater deforestation, even in places that have a tradition of care for the land. Last thing you said is, what about leaving trees down? What about the litter? And that's ecologically incredibly important. Are we doing a very good job of it right now? Forest Service knows this is a good thing. They also have to move quickly. I'm not going to badmouth them, but I would say it's not tremendously successful. On the other hand, there are places where they are leaving dead trees standing, snags, knowing that they will fall. And so there's an effort being made. It's not perfect, but it's also not imperfect, if that makes sense.
Great questions from the audience. We have one question in the virtual chat that is a bit of a technical question. You were talking about how in like a typical fire, they're not supposed to kill all the trees, but the unnatural fires kill everything. So Steve was asking for those old growth ponderosa that withstand fire and survive. Do they have like fewer branches close to the ground? And does that prevent like grass fires from reaching the vulnerable branches with dry leaves close to the ground? Is that correct?
I think so. I run out of runway with some of these, some of the more technical questions. What I can tell you is that I understand that in a healthy fire, it is the oldest trees that typically survive because they have the thickest bark. And so ponderosas are fire evolved. All pines are, but ponderosas particularly so. So whereas the younger trees have thinner bark, and even though they're younger and more supple, they tend to die. And so those trees are called, in Spanish, there's a term from them, they're the árboles madre, the mother trees, that will then seed the next generation of trees in a healthy fire. I don't know if it's necessarily that their branches are lower. I really think what happens is, as I understand it, is that that unhealthy fires are so hot that they go right through the bark, which is highly fire resistant, but not fire resistant to a tremendous firestorm.
Thank you. That kind of reminds me of when we were hearing in the news about the fire in Maui. There was that large historic tree in Lahaina that they said may have survived, and it's obviously an older tree. You're shaking your head, so maybe not. But
Maybe not.
Is that the same concept where
It
it has
is.
that thicker bark? Okay.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, theoretically, a forester, I think, most foresters would say, there's no reason trees have to die, necessarily. They all do. Lightning strike, wind, beetle kill, disease, but trees can live a very long time, and those that have lived a long time are therefore, sort of by definition, more resistant or have resisted some of these things in the past. So, so there is a reason, I think, why typically some of these very old and historic and sometimes sacred trees have survived. There's one in Mexico that's very famous that predates by a lot the conquest of Mexico, the European invasion. That was sacred around, well, we know it's sacred at least around 1000 AD, BC, AD, 1000 after 1000 of the current era, was already huge and sacred, and it's still with us. The Árbol de Tule, and you know it's still going great guns, but you know, nothing lasts forever.
Right. I think we are at 7 o'clock, so we'll take one last question from our audience.
It's not a question, it's just that in the past, when the ponderosa pine forest were thinner, you had the large trees, and yes, their branches and needles were up high, and so you rarely ever got a crown fire. So it's a combination of the thinness of the understory, the fact that fires were very hot, that the bark on the older trees was really thick, and that the fire never got up.
Very good point. Yeah. Crown fires are a modern invention, more or less. Well, thank you so much, and thanks to those of you who took time out online.
Thank you.
I'm really humbled and honored.
Thank you, Dr. Boyer, for coming down from Flagstaff for this event. That's all for tonight, folks, so we're going to be signing off from the live stream.